The procedure they called Suicidal wasn't born in a training manual. It was invented 20 feet above a runway, driven by a desperate need to cheat death after surviving hell in the skies over Germany. March 8, 1944. RAF Woodbridge, Suffolk, England. 1,437 hours. Flight Lieutenant Michael Reynolds, his posture rigid with professional anxiety, stood peering out from the safety of the control tower. His binoculars were pressed hard against his face, focusing on a magnificent but tragically damaged B-17 flying fortress that was barely managing to limp toward the colossal emergency landing strip. The roar of its remaining engines sounded strained and ragged, mixed with the unsettling rush of wind through damaged airframe components. Dark, greasy smoke smeared the sky behind the bomber, a clear sign that at least two of the powerful engines were failing catastrophically, struggling against the inevitable drag that pulled the giant aircraft down toward the earth. The pilot was fighting a losing battle against gravity and mechanics. The landing gear assembly on the port side hung down at an angle that defied normal physics, clearly twisted and likely jammed, a precarious indicator of the structural trauma the aircraft had endured. One of the main tires, usually a robust piece of reinforced rubber designed to absorb thousands of pounds of shock, had been shredded into useless ribbons by shards of German flak fragments fired relentlessly over Bremen earlier that morning. Reynolds knew this scenario intimately. He had watched countless times as these crippled giants struggled back from the European mainland. In the preceding 4 months alone, he had tracked 184 heavily damaged American bombers attempting perilous returns to the expansive safety of Woodbridge. 17 of those aircraft had disintegrated violently on impact or during the crucial final approach, never reaching a safe parking position. The grim statistics were always a silent weight on his shoulders. Yet, this particular approach was fundamentally different. Something about the bomber's flight profile triggered an alarm deep within Reynolds, chilling his blood despite the mild English afternoon air. The flying fortress was moving at a terrifying velocity. It was flying far, far too fast for a safe landing operation. Standard operating procedure stipulated that the massive B-17 should maintain an approach speed of precisely 110 miles per hour, a delicate balance of control and momentum required for the heavy aircraft. This returning bomber looked like it was slicing through the air at a reckless 145, perhaps even 150 miles per hour. Furthermore, it wasn't following the prescribed, gradual glide path that every pilot was rigorously trained to follow. Instead, it was coming in almost totally flat, maintaining a near-level flight attitude, as if the crew intended to fly straight through the massive 9,000-foot runway rather than gently settling upon it. Reynolds snatched the radio handset from its cradle, his voice tight with urgency. "Fortress on approach, you are flying way too fast. Immediately pull up and attempt to go around. Acknowledge." Silence. There was no answering click, no confirmation from the stressed crew in the cockpit. The B-17 roared across the runway threshold markers at what Reynolds estimated was an incredible 155 miles per hour. Every instinct Reynolds had honed over 2 harrowing years managing emergency operations screamed one terrifying truth. This bomber was destined to cartwheel end over end down the tarmac, erupting into a catastrophic ball of fire and fragmented wreckage. His hand instinctively reached for the red crash alert button, the signal that would instantly deploy fire trucks and medical teams. But then, at an altitude of approximately 20 feet above the unyielding tarmac, the pilot executed a maneuver Reynolds had never witnessed in his entire professional career, a deliberate act of aeronautical defiance. The 4 immense engines suddenly went silent. The pilot had rammed all 4 throttle levers back to the idle stop simultaneously, while at the very same instant hauling the heavy control yoke fully into his chest. This audacious action was specifically designed to do one thing: deliberately, violently stall the 36,000-pound bomber just mere seconds before its intended touchdown. The B-17, robbed instantaneously of both lift and forward thrust, behaved exactly as engineered. It dropped like a massive stone. Inside the cockpit, the harsh, shrill sound of the stall warning horn blared, a desperate, electronic scream of impending doom. The great wings instantly ceased their generating of necessary lift. The entire aircraft plummeted straight down those last critical 20 feet and impacted the runway with a sickening, yet strangely controlled explosion of sound. The landing gear, though stressed far beyond normal limits, managed to absorb the colossal vertical impact. The massive bomber bounced only once, a stiff, immediate rebound, before settling violently and then rolling quickly to a stop in a staggeringly short distance, less than 2,000 feet of runway. Reynolds slowly lowered his binoculars, his breath held tight in his chest. His hands, usually steady and reliable, were shaking uncontrollably, a physical reaction to the near catastrophe averted. What he had just witnessed, a technique that every airfield controller in England would soon be calling the power-off stall landing, would ultimately save hundreds of aircraft hulls and countless thousands of lives over the next 15 agonizing months of the air war. Yet, before this technique could become the standard procedure it was destined to be, one lone pilot had to convince the entirety of the United States Army Air Force's command structure that intentionally forcing a heavy bomber into a stall during its final approach was not merely an act of reckless suicide, but rather an essential strategy for survival. What this innovative pilot could not yet know was that his highly controversial technique would evolve into one of the most effective and vehemently debated emergency procedures of the entire conflict. By the early months of 1944, the massive strategic bombing campaign targeting Nazi-occupied Europe had escalated to a complexity and scale absolutely unprecedented in the history of warfare. The United States 8th Air Force alone possessed the operational capacity to dispatch upwards of 1,000 heavy bombers on single missions, a colossal armada darkening the skies. Each of these formidable aircraft carried a highly trained crew of 10 men and up to 8,000 pounds of potent high explosives deep into the heart of the Third Reich. The resulting cost, measured both in human lives and irreplaceable aircraft, was staggering and unsustainable. Between the frigid months of January and May 1944, the 8th Air Force suffered the loss of more than 800 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators due directly to enemy action. We must remember the grim toll taken on October 14, 1943, a date forever enshrined in the 8th Air Force's annals as Black Thursday. On that terrible day, 291 B-17s were dispatched to strike the critical ball-bearing factories located deep within Schweinfurt, Germany. 60 of those bombers were violently shot down from the sky. An additional 17 were so catastrophically damaged that they were written off beyond any possible repair. More than 600 airmen were either killed, grievously wounded, or captured. This represented a devastating 26% loss rate in just a single day's mission. But these horrific, catastrophic losses over the target only represented one fragment of the enormous problem. For every bomber destroyed high above German territory, another 2 or sometimes 3 managed to struggle back across the North Sea to England, often so severely battered and crippled that conventional landing procedures transformed into lethal, high-stakes gambles. The B-17G Flying Fortress was rightly considered a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering for its time. It was propelled by 4 robust 1,200 horsepower Wright-R 1820 Cyclone radial engines, and it possessed the ability to ferry 13 personnel, 6,000 pounds of ordnance, and unleash fire from 13 powerful .50 caliber machine guns on targets located more than 1,000 miles away. Its famous moniker, the Flying Fortress, was not mere hyperbole. It accurately reflected its genuine, astonishing capacity for defensive survival. This bomber could absorb truly immense punishment from flak and fighters and still stubbornly remain airborne, clawing its way back to safety. However, landing a B-17 that had been ravaged by combat demanded an impossible synergy of precision control and pure luck. Standard landing protocols mandated a long, meticulously stable approach, flown at that critical speed of 110 miles per hour, followed by a gentle, controlled flare maneuver, culminating in a soft touchdown at roughly 90 miles per hour. Furthermore, the essential landing gear system required flawless hydraulic pressure, perfectly functioning brake systems, and tires that remained fully intact. Combat damage annihilated all of these fundamental assumptions. Bombers routinely returned with their critical hydraulic lines completely severed, resulting in landing gear that deployed either uselessly or, often, with dangerous asymmetry. They came home with their essential brakes shot away, tires savagely shredded by explosive flak, and control surfaces, like rudders or elevators, badly damaged or entirely missing. Some flew home as skeletal remains, entire sections of their massive wings or tail structures having been violently blasted away, fundamentally compromising their delicate aerodynamics. The emergency landing strips spread across England, RAF Woodbridge, RAF Manston, and RAF Carnaby, were purpose-built specifically to accommodate these damaged, returning bombers. Woodbridge's main concrete expanse stretched 9,000 feet, an extraordinary length, fully 3 times longer than most standard operational bomber bases. Yet, sheer length alone could not resolve the fundamental dilemma facing the crews. When a pilot attempted to bring a damaged B-17 in utilizing the established standard procedures, the requirement for a long, stable approach and that gentle flare demanded precise, unwavering control inputs. If the hydraulic system was failing rapidly, if the engines were coughing and sputtering unpredictably, if the control surfaces were sluggish or destroyed, that required precision became utterly impossible to achieve. Pilots found themselves fighting the crippled aircraft all the way down, frantically attempting to maintain the mandatory 110 miles per hour and a stable descent rate while the bomber actively resisted their every command. The consequences were terribly predictable and horrifying. Bombers stalled suddenly at 50 feet and violently tumbled from the sky. They landed so hard that their fragile landing gear collapsed instantly, sending them skidding off runways in massive showers of sparks and pulverized metal. Others touched down much too fast, lacked the necessary functional brakes or stopping power, and ran off the far end of the runway, slamming into adjacent fields or unforgiving obstacles. Between late November 1943 and the close of February 1944, the logs at RAF Woodbridge alone recorded 17 separate landing accidents that directly resulted in the total destruction of the aircraft and, tragically, the loss of life for multiple crew members. Medical officers stationed at these crucial emergency strips described the grim pattern with chilling clarity. Crews who had defied death high over Germany frequently perished in landing mishaps right back at their own bases or at the emergency fields. Men who had endured intense flak barrages and survived desperate fighter assaults died simply because their severely damaged aircraft could not execute the precise, controlled approach that the rigid standard procedures demanded. The Army Air Force's flying regulations were explicit and unambiguous. Standard approach speeds and detailed procedures existed for sound, logical reasons. They represented the safest, most statistically proven method to land a B-17 under normal, everyday circumstances. Deviating from these sanctioned procedures carried the serious risk of severe punishment, including court-martial or permanent grounding. But what those binding regulations failed entirely to account for was the stark reality that by 1944, normal conditions simply did not exist for these returning crews. The rules designed to guarantee maximum safety were, in effect, becoming active agents of death. The system was caught in a deadly paradox. How do you land an aircraft safely when the means to achieve that safety, precision, and control have been shot away? Someone, somewhere, had to demonstrate definitively that the regulations themselves, the procedures specifically designed and intended to preserve life, were actively killing the very crews they were meant to protect. And proving this revolutionary concept would require a pilot possessing the immense courage and self-belief to risk absolutely everything on a technique that appeared, to every professional observer, like an act of deliberate, calculated self-destruction. Captain Howard "Slim" Buie was emphatically not a test pilot. He had never been an aeronautical engineer. He held no degree in advanced aviation science, possessed no specialized training in experimental flight procedures, nor did he carry any official credentials that would suggest he was uniquely qualified to fundamentally revolutionize emergency landing doctrine for heavy bombers. He was merely a 26-year-old combat pilot assigned to the 388th Bomb Group, stationed at RAF Nettishall in Suffolk. By February 1944, Buie had successfully completed 18 grueling missions over Germany, raids targeting Hamburg, Brunswick, Frankfurt, and the deeply defended capital, Berlin. He had personally witnessed friends dying in violent flak bursts occurring at 25,000 feet. He had seen bombers vanish in catastrophic mid-air collisions. He had nursed his own crippled aircraft back across the treacherous North Sea with engines ablaze and hydraulic fluid streaming in a desperate plume behind him. But increasingly, the thing that gnawed relentlessly at his professional conscience was not the terror they faced high above the target. It was what invariably happened after the crews made it home. Buie watched in quiet despair as multiple damaged bombers crashed fatally during landing attempts at their own home fields. The pattern was devastatingly clear and unmistakable. Crews that had survived the mission, successfully navigating their crippled machines across the entire North Sea, making it agonizingly close to safety in England, they died because standard landing procedures demanded a level of control authority that their ravaged bombers could simply not provide. The highly unorthodox concept solidified in his mind during a routine discussion with his flight engineer in late February. They were intently discussing a recent emergency landing accident Buie had witnessed. A B-17 suffering from totally crippled hydraulics that had violently bounced repeatedly upon initial contact with the runway. Each subsequent impact worsened the structural damage until, inevitably, the landing gear buckled and collapsed, sending the aircraft cartwheeling violently off the runway's edge. 3 irreplaceable crewmen died instantly. The engineer casually remarked that the destructive bouncing occurred because the aircraft was still possessing flying speed when its tires first contacted the runway surface. What if it wasn't flying? Buie suddenly asked, his gaze intense. The engineer stared back at him with an expression of pure incredulity, as if Buie had suggested jumping out without a parachute. Then, Captain, the engineer replied slowly, it would simply fall. Exactly, Buie stated simply. On February 23, 1944, Buie formally approached his squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Creer, with an exceptionally unusual request. He wanted official authorization to conduct a series of specialized test flights designed specifically to practice radical emergency landing procedures within a controlled environment. Creer, who had personally watched 7 aircraft from his own squadron destroyed in landing accidents over the previous 3 months, was grimly receptive to any unconventional solution. He granted the necessary permission. Buie took off immediately in B-17G serial number 42 to 31983, a tough, war-weary bomber that had been designated for training duties only, retired from combat after accumulating extensive structural damage that deemed it unfit for operational missions. He climbed steadily to 5,000 feet over the picturesque, rolling English countryside. And then he executed the very action that every single regulation, every single training manual, and every single instructor in the entire Army Air Forces establishment had relentlessly taught him never, ever to attempt. He deliberately stalled the heavy bomber while simulating an approach to landing. What transpired over the subsequent 45 minutes would either confirm Captain Buie as an unrecognized genius or tragically result in his immediate death. The results were far from certain. What he couldn't possibly know at that moment was that within 90 short days, his highly unorthodox technique would be formally integrated into official Army Air Force emergency procedures, and that it would ultimately lead to a dramatic reduction in crew fatalities resulting from emergency landings, estimated at a staggering 60% improvement. For his very first attempt, Buie meticulously configured the aircraft for a standard landing. Gear lowered, wing flaps fully extended, and engine throttles smoothly retarded. He established a perfectly normal approach speed of 110 miles per hour. Then, at an estimated altitude of 200 feet, he decisively pulled all 4 throttles to the idle position and hauled back with great force on the yoke, intentionally inducing the bomber into a sudden, complete aerodynamic stall. The B-17 responded instantly and violently, falling through the air like a chunk of lead. The stall warning horn screamed deafeningly, a high-pitched, insistent sound of imminent disaster. The heavy control yoke went alarmingly mushy and unresponsive in his hands, confirming the total loss of effective control authority. The altimeter rapidly unwound, indicating a frightening descent rate of 800 feet per minute. At 100 feet, Buie aggressively jammed the throttles forward again, simultaneously pushed the nose firmly down, and successfully recovered the massive aircraft from the precipitous drop, leveling out barely above the trees. His heart hammered painfully against his ribs. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Kirkland, sat beside him, silent and utterly white-knuckled, hands frozen in place. Again, Buie commanded simply. Second attempt. The same meticulous configuration was used, but this time, Buie intentionally waited until the aircraft reached 100 feet before inducing the stall. The bomber dropped violently and suddenly. Recovery was agonizingly delayed and barely achieved. Too high, Buie muttered, immediately recognizing the danger. Third attempt, 50 feet. Better, Buie conceded, but still far too much altitude to safely lose in an uncontrolled drop. Fourth attempt, 30 feet. The bomber stalled cleanly, dropped sharply, and Buie managed to recover the aircraft just 10 feet above the ground. Close, he assessed, sweat beading on his forehead. Fifth attempt. This time, Captain Buie fundamentally altered the flight parameters based on his previous failures. He brought the B-17 in at a scorching 140 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour faster than the rigid standard procedure. He maintained full, healthy power until the absolute last possible moment. At approximately 20 feet above the runway threshold, he performed the critical simultaneous action. He yanked all 4 throttles back to idle instantly and pulled the control yoke fiercely into his stomach. The bomber's nose pitched up aggressively, achieving a perfect stall attitude. Airspeed instantly bled off in a massive rush. The stall warning horn blared, high and terrified. The wings, having lost all lift, stopped flying, and the B-17 dropped straight down onto the runway surface in a perfectly level attitude. The immense, controlled force of the landing gear fully absorbed the vertical impact. The bomber bounced slightly, a small, controllable movement, before settling definitively and rolling out. Buie immediately applied the brakes. They stopped completely in less than 2,000 feet. Kirkland stared at his captain, his expression a mix of terror and professional awe. That, Kirkland finally managed to stammer, was either the absolute craziest thing I have ever witnessed or the smartest. Let's fly it again and find out for certain, Buie replied, his voice level despite the adrenaline surge. Over the next 3 intensive days, Captain Buie practiced this unique technique repeatedly, refining the execution with the dedication of an artisan perfecting a craft. He began to pinpoint the precise parameters required for consistent success. Optimal approach speed, he determined, needed to be maintained between 135 and 145 miles per hour. This speed was fast enough to guarantee excellent control authority and responsiveness in a damaged airframe, but not so fast that the resulting mandatory stall drop became uncontrollably violent or destructive. The truly critical moment, he learned, was the throttle retardation sequence. All 4 engines absolutely had to be pulled back to idle simultaneously. Failure to do so would result in asymmetric thrust, immediately causing the nose to yaw violently and initiating a catastrophic roll, which would be impossible to correct at such low altitude. Furthermore, the yoke pull had to be aggressive and immediate. A gentle, traditional flare attempt would fail to stall the aircraft quickly enough to drop it cleanly. The technique worked brilliantly precisely because it eradicated the critical variables that had consistently destroyed damaged bombers. There was no long, slow, agonizing descent, giving wounded systems sufficient time to fail completely. There was no requirement for a gentle, precise flare that demanded impossible control inputs from battered surfaces. Most importantly, there was no touchdown while the aircraft was still actively flying, which was the direct cause of those devastating runway bounces. The bomber simply fell the final 20 feet in a carefully controlled stall, striking the runway surface hard enough that its sheer momentum forced it to stay firmly down, eliminating the dangerous bounce. On February 28th, Captain Buie formally demonstrated the refined technique to Lieutenant Colonel Creer. Creer watched from the tower, a study in skepticism, as Buie brought the heavy B-17 screaming over the threshold at 145 miles per hour, intentionally forced it to stall, and dropped it onto the runway with an impact that visibly shook the control tower structure. Creer remained silent for a long, heavy moment. Then he spoke, his voice measured. "Do that exactly again, Captain. And this time, I intend to come with you." In the ready room, every pilot was convinced that Buie had just definitively signed the paperwork for his own court-martial. They universally labeled the technique as suicidal. They insisted it was not only dangerous but completely illegal, according to every established doctrine. The Army Air Force's resistance to Buie's technique was not born of simple bureaucratic stubbornness or a lack of imagination. It was deeply rooted in sound, time-honored aeronautical principles and decades of hard-won, often fatal experience. Stalling any aircraft in close proximity to the ground was, statistically, the the most frequent cause of fatal accidents in all of aviation history. Every single pilot learned this terrifying lesson during basic flight training. The physical equations governing flight were simple and unforgiving. When an aircraft stalls, it instantaneously loses the lift necessary to support its weight. The wings stop working. The aircraft falls. At a high altitude, a pilot has precious time. Time to push the nose down, regain essential airspeed, and recover lift. At 20 feet above a solid concrete runway, there is zero time. There is only inevitable, destructive impact. The B-17's inherent stall characteristics exacerbated this danger significantly. The Flying Fortress did not stall cleanly, dropping the nose predictably. Instead, it mushed, its nose dropping sharply while one wing usually fell violently before the other, often initiating an uncontrollable spin. The heavy aircraft routinely lost between 200 and 400 feet of precious altitude before an experienced pilot could even begin to regain control authority. Training manuals explicitly warned every pilot never to allow their airspeed to fall below safe operating margins during approach and landing. Instructors at B-17 training bases across the United States, in Texas, New Mexico, and Kansas, drilled standard, rigorous procedures relentlessly into every cadet. Maintain 110 miles per hour on approach. Begin the flare maneuver at 20 feet. Reduce power smoothly and gradually. Allow the aircraft to settle gently onto the runway with the absolute minimum vertical sink rate. Any deviation from these strict procedures was instantly corrected and formally documented. Repeat offenders were immediately washed out of training and removed from the program. The logic behind this rigidity was irrefutable according to the command structure. If pilots were permitted to learn non-standard procedures, they would inevitably begin using them routinely, perhaps even when unnecessary. And if they used them routinely, the number of routine accidents would invariably multiply. Was it not safer, the hierarchy reasoned, to occasionally lose damaged aircraft and experienced crews than to train thousands of pilots in techniques that held the potential to kill them during normal, undamaged operations? But the second demonstration, flown with Colonel Creer in the right seat, convinced the skeptical commander completely. On March 5, 1944, Captain Buie received the formal authorization he desperately needed, permission to conduct official demonstration flights for senior commanding officers and seasoned check pilots. The request quickly moved up the chain of command, landing squarely on the desk of the 8th Bomber Command Headquarters. Skepticism throughout the entire command was, predictably, fierce and visceral. The briefing room at Bomber Command Headquarters on March 12, 1944, was packed shoulder to shoulder. Buie stood at the front, facing an intimidating audience of 23 group commanders, high-ranking operations officers, and Army Air Force's flight safety inspectors. Most of the officers had their arms crossed firmly across their chests, expressions openly hostile. Colonel James Wilson, the formidable chief of flight safety, spoke first, his voice hard. "Captain Buie, you are formally asking us to authorize a procedure that directly violates every single regulation in the existing Army Air Force flight book. You are asking us to teach our pilots to intentionally and deliberately stall their heavy aircraft 20 feet above a concrete runway. Do you, Captain, fully grasp the sheer magnitude of what you are proposing here?" "Yes, sir, I do," Buie answered calmly. "If we authorize this catastrophic procedure and pilots begin utilizing it routinely, we will see fatal accidents rates skyrocket across the command. We will kill more men in the training phases than we will ever save in actual combat operations." "How can you defend this, Captain?" Wilson demanded. "Permission to respond, sir?" "Proceed." "Sir, the power-off stall technique is not intended for routine operation," Buie explained clearly. "It is specifically designed strictly for emergency use. Aircraft suffering total hydraulic failures, major control surface damage, multiple engine failures, or landing gear malfunctions. For aircraft that unfortunately fit those criteria, the current mandatory procedures are already killing crews at an unsustainable 23% fatality rate. The power-off stall technique, based on my rigorous testing, can reduce that rate to under 10%. Based on what verifiable data, Captain? Based on 31 consecutive, successful demonstrations over the last 2 weeks, sir. 0 failures, 0 structural damage to the test aircraft. And, sir, based on the fundamental fact that standard procedures require sustained, precise control authority for 60 to 90 seconds from the final approach point to actual touchdown. The power-off stall reduces that maximum stress window to only 15 seconds. For a damaged bomber, sir, that 15 seconds is often the defining difference between surviving or not. The room immediately erupted into chaos and shouting. "It is insane," one officer yelled. "You will kill pilots," another voice protested. "This procedure directly violates fundamental flight safety principles." Then, a single, authoritative voice cut sharply through the surrounding noise and disbelief. It belonged to Brigadier General Frederick Castle, the highly respected commander of the 4th Combat Bombardment Wing. General Castle had recently suffered the bitter loss of 11 bombers in landing accidents in the preceding 4 months alone. His personal commitment to crew survival was absolute. "Gentlemen, please observe silence," Castle commanded. "I have personally reviewed Captain Buie's demonstration footage. I have spoken at length with his squadron commander, Colonel Creer. And, perhaps most importantly, I have personally watched Captain Buie execute this technique. Our current standard procedures are optimally designed for perfectly undamaged aircraft returning under normal conditions. Captain Buie has ingeniously developed a procedure that is optimized for the brutal, actual conditions our crews face when they return critically damaged from combat." Castle continued, his voice firm. "I formally move that we immediately authorize the emergency use of this technique at all designated emergency airfields, provided we establish rigorous and proper training protocols." The packed room fell into a heavy, instantaneous silence. Colonel Wilson stared first at General Castle, then directly at Captain Buie. Finally, he spoke, his authority heavy in the air. "I require 50 more successful demonstrations, Captain. I want comprehensive training protocols formally written and approved. I want the restrictions and operational limits clearly defined and documented. And I want this explicitly understood. If I see one single fatal accident that is directly attributable to the misuse of this technique, it will be immediately and permanently shut down." On March 19, 1944, the 8th Bomber Command formally issued Technical Order 123, Emergency Landing Procedures for Combat-Damaged B-17 Aircraft. The power-off stall landing, once considered an act of reckless folly, was officially authorized for essential emergency use at all designated airfields. 3 days later, a B-17 returned to England with both main landing gear tires entirely blown out and its hydraulic system rapidly failing. The pilot utilized Buie's technique at RAF Woodbridge. The aircraft landed successfully, though violently. The crew of 10 walked away uninjured, exchanging nervous glances and silent thanks. It was the first successful outcome of what would become hundreds. If you are learning something truly fascinating and genuinely important about this largely untold story of wartime innovation, please hit that subscribe button right now. Here at Winds of Thought, we are dedicated to uncovering the real heroes and crucial innovations of the Second World War, whose vital contributions saved thousands of lives, but have been tragically forgotten by history. And please, take a moment to drop a comment below. We want to know, where exactly are you watching from today? And had you ever heard about this controversial power-off stall landing technique before watching this video? The power-off stall landing technique succeeded because it fundamentally redefined the parameters of what constituted a successful emergency landing. Traditional procedures prioritized 2 factors: smoothness and total control. Buie's radical technique prioritized one thing above all others: getting the massive aircraft firmly onto the ground before catastrophic, irreversible failure occurred. Engineering analysis was quickly conducted by test pilots at Wright Field in April 1944, and it conclusively revealed the crucial reasons why the technique proved so immensely effective for damaged aircraft. A conventional landing approach demanded sustained, delicate control authority for a demanding 60 to 90 seconds from the final approach gate to the final touchdown point. During this agonizingly long period, a damaged bomber's systems were under continuous escalating stress. Engines struggled to maintain necessary power, hydraulic lines leaked pressure at critical rates, and control surfaces responded sluggishly or completely erratically. The power-off stall approach dramatically reduced that window of systemic stress to approximately 15 seconds. The aircraft was fully configured for landing much earlier, at a safer, higher altitude. The approach itself was flown hot and fast, creating conditions where even damaged aircraft maintained excellent, crisp control response. Then, in the last crucial moments, everything happened in a simultaneous, decisive burst. Power cut, yoke hauled back, controlled stall initiated, followed by immediate impact. The resultant hard landing, which would have been utterly unacceptable under normal training circumstances, actually served to benefit the damaged aircraft structure. The B-17's robust landing gear was expertly designed to absorb immense vertical loads, rated up to 10 feet per second of sink rate. A perfectly executed power-off stall initiated from 20 feet typically produced sink rates of approximately 8 feet per second. Rough, certainly, but still safely within the bomber's design limitations. Crucially, the violent, hard impact completely eliminated the dangerous potential for bouncing. The bomber hit once, used up its kinetic energy on the ground, and stayed absolutely down. Sometimes survival demands breaking every rule in the book. May 7, 1944. Captain Robert "Rosie" Rosenthal, a pilot with the legendary 100th Bomb Group, known grimly as the Bloody 100th, was returning from a grueling mission targeting Berlin. His B-17, christened Rosie's Riveters, had sustained catastrophic, almost unbelievable damage. The No. 2 engine was totally destroyed, trailing a heavy, persistent smoke plume. The entire hydraulic system was bleeding fluid at a frightening critical rate. The right main landing gear tire had been violently shredded by flak fragments, leaving only bare metal and rubber scraps. Rosenthal radioed ahead to the critical emergency field at RAF Woodbridge. Woodbridge Tower, this is Lucky 724, declaring emergency. We will attempt the power-off stall landing. Over. The reply came back instantly, calm and professional. Lucky 74, Woodbridge. Runway 27 is clear. Emergency crew standing by. You are cleared for power-off stall approach. Rosenthal flew the massive bomber in at a blistering 142 miles per hour. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Sam Turner, chanted the altitude calls. 50 feet, 40, 30, 20. At 18 feet, Rosenthal executed the precise maneuver. He yanked all 4 throttles to idle instantaneously and hauled the yoke fiercely into his chest. The heavy bomber stalled, dropped like a hammer, and slammed onto the runway surface. The shredded right main tire exploded completely upon impact, the sound muffled by the roar of the impact, but the sturdy landing gear held fast. The bomber veered slightly to the right, attempting to swap ends. Rosenthal instantly corrected the yaw using the rudder pedals, fighting the compromised controls. They rolled smoothly to a complete stop in just over 2,000 feet. The entire 10-man crew walked away from the wreckage, miraculously uninjured. Rosenthal later recounted in a post-war interview, "Standard procedures would have absolutely killed us that day. The hydraulics were failing so rapidly that by the time we would have reached the runway in a conventional approach, we would have had zero control authority left. The power-off stall technique ensured we got down before everything quit entirely." Between March and August 1944, RAF Woodbridge meticulously recorded 127 separate emergency landings utilizing Buie's revolutionary power-off stall technique. Of those attempts, 119 resulted in successful, survivable landings with 0 crew fatalities, a remarkable 94% success rate under extreme circumstances. The 8 reported failures occurred primarily when pilots critically misjudged the precise stall point, or when structural damage was so extreme it caused an impossible, asymmetric stall, situations where no known landing technique could have saved the aircraft. Compared directly to the grim statistics from the previous 4 months, where emergency landing accidents at Woodbridge killed or grievously injured crews in 23% of cases, the staggering improvement was stark and undeniable. The power-off stall technique had resulted in a demonstrable reduction in crew casualties from emergency landings by approximately 60%. August 12, 1944. Lieutenant William Wild Bill Loy was bringing home a B-17 so badly damaged that, according to later reports, the German fighter pilots had simply ceased attacking it, assuming it was destined to crash on its own. a guaranteed kill. The entire nose section of the flying fortress was completely shredded. The bombardier was dead. The navigator was severely wounded. 2 of the 4 essential engines were completely incapacitated. The tail section was riddled with cannon fire, looking like a piece of Swiss cheese. Loy somehow coaxed the dying bomber across the turbulent English Channel. He radioed RAF Manston, another emergency field, requesting urgent clearance. He was briefed on the power-off stall technique, a procedure he had received training in but had never been forced to execute under real pressure. "First time for everything, I suppose?" he muttered to his co-pilot, bracing himself. He brought the heavy bomber in at 138 miles per hour. At precisely 20 feet, he forced the stall. The B-17 dropped violently and hard. The impact is so severe, so physically jarring, that equipment in the radio compartment reportedly tore free from its mountings, but the crucial landing gear absorbed the shock and held firm. The aircraft rapidly ground to a halt. 9 of the 10 crewmen survived the horrific ordeal. Loy would subsequently receive the Medal of Honor, not specifically for the landing, but for the astonishing heroism demonstrated during the mission itself. Yet, contained within his official citation was one profound, crucial line. Lieutenant Loy's skillful emergency landing prevented further loss of life among his crew. The German perspective on the astounding resilience of the American bombers was later captured vividly in interrogation reports of Luftwaffe pilots who had been shot down and captured. Hauptmann Klaus Faber, a seasoned fighter pilot attached to JG-2, was captured over France in July 1944. During his subsequent interrogation, he offered a weary assessment. "We knew we absolutely had to hit the American bombers with extreme prejudice the very first time. If they somehow managed to make it back across the Channel to England, they would land successfully, regardless of how severely damaged they appeared. We simply did not comprehend how they were achieving this feat. Bombers that we were certain were finished would simply touch down. It was profoundly demoralizing for us." Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, another experienced Luftwaffe pilot, recorded his thoughts in his diary in May 1944. "Attacking a B-17 formation now feels like trying to make love to a flaming porcupine. Their defensive firepower is fearsome. But even worse is the sick knowledge that the bombers we damage, the ones we believe we have destroyed, somehow still make it home. The Americans have learned something fundamental that we have not. What they had learned was simple: that survival, in extreme circumstances, sometimes meant deliberately ignoring every established rule in the flying manual." By June 1944, the technique was rapidly spreading far beyond the B-17 crews. Pilots flying the massive B-24 Liberator found that their higher wing loading required slightly modified parameters. Generally, a faster approach speed and a slightly earlier reduction of thrust. Pilots of P-47 Thunderbolt fighters utilized a modified version of the technique when forced to land with damaged landing gear that wouldn't deploy properly. Even the RAF Bomber Command, which had initially been the most skeptical, formally authorized British pilots to employ variations of the technique with damaged Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers returning from missions. The psychological impact of this innovation was arguably as significant as the statistical one. Bomber crews flying deep into hostile territory gained a vital piece of knowledge. If they could just manage to coax their damaged aircraft back across the Channel to English airspace, they possessed options. They were no longer required to execute a perfect, delicate landing in an aircraft that was barely controllable. They could come in extremely fast, stall it deliberately, and hit the ground hard. As long as the essential landing gear structure held together, they knew they would walk away. This belief system was crucial for morale. Between March 1944 and the final conclusion of the war in Europe in May 1945, the 3 primary emergency landing strips in England, RAF Woodbridge, Manston, and Carnaby, recorded an astonishing 2,400 emergency landings executed by damaged American bombers. Post-war analysis meticulously conducted by Army Air Force historians estimated that approximately 40% of those crucial landings employed the power-off stall technique or one of its validated variations. If the technique is credited with reducing crew fatalities by the confirmed 60% in applicable cases, rough but reliable calculations suggest that it saved between 500 and 800 airmen's lives. 500 to 800 men who would have perished in landing accidents using rigid conventional procedures survived by implementing Captain Buie's radical method. 500 to 800 men who went home permanently after the war concluded. This incredible story of forgotten genius and wartime innovation only becomes more remarkable as we consider the legacy. Make absolutely certain you are subscribed to Winds of Thought because we are committed to bringing you these profound, untold innovations from World War II that fundamentally changed the trajectory of modern warfare forever. And if you wish to support this specific type of deep dive historical research, please hit that like button. It signals to the YouTube algorithm to show this video to more history enthusiasts just like you. Captain Howard Buie successfully completed his combat tour in June 1944, flying his 25th and final mission on June 18th, a major raid directed against oil refineries in Hamburg. He immediately returned to the United States and spent the remaining duration of the war serving as a dedicated instructor at B-17 training bases located in Idaho and Kansas. There, he personally taught the highly specialized power-off stall technique to hundreds of replacement pilots, spreading the life-saving knowledge far and wide. In May 1944, he was officially awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation formally noted his development of innovative emergency procedures that saved numerous lives and aircraft. Significantly, it made no mention whatsoever of the fact that he had technically violated numerous foundational regulations to develop and prove those very procedures. The results spoke for themselves with unquestionable authority. Buie remained committed to the armed forces after 1945, successfully transitioning into the newly established United States Air Force in 1947. He finally retired honorably as a lieutenant colonel in 1963, having dedicated 23 years of continuous service. He never once sought personal publicity for his life-saving innovation. He never wrote an autobiography. He never appeared on television programs or gave lengthy, self-aggrandizing interviews. When asked about the technique late in his life, he offered a characteristic, humble summation. "I simply did not want to see any more friends die in landing accidents back home. That's truly all it was." Howard Buie passed away in 1989 at the age of 71, remaining largely unknown outside the tight-knit community of B-17 veterans who directly credited his technique with saving their lives and guaranteeing their safe return. At the 388th Bomb Group reunion in 1987, a former B-17 crew chief named Thomas McKinley sought out Buie specifically. McKinley had been stationed at RAF Woodbridge, serving as part of the critical emergency ground crew team. He shook Buie's hand firmly, his eyes welling up. "Sir, I never had the honor of meeting you during the conflict, but I need you to know that I personally watched 47 bombers land using your technique. 47 aircraft that would have certainly crashed using the standard procedures. That means 470 men. Some of those men are right here at this reunion today. Because of your courage, Captain Buie, we came home." Buie, true to form, simply nodded and offered a soft, characteristic, "I'm glad it helped." The technique's profound influence extended dramatically beyond the confines of World War II. Post-war training doctrine for all aircraft incorporated the crucial concept that fundamentally different situations demand fundamentally different procedural responses. The rigid, dogmatic adherence to single-method approaches gradually gave way to more flexible, adaptable operational frameworks. Military and civilian flight training programs alike began shifting their emphasis toward critical pilot judgment. The precise skill of knowing when to adhere strictly to standard procedures and when circumstances demanded immediate, radical alternatives. Modern aviation continues to grapple with the exact same fundamental question that Captain Buie answered decisively in 1944. When do established regulations, meticulously designed for normal conditions, transform into actively dangerous liabilities in abnormal ones? The answer, codified explicitly in current emergency procedures for both major military and civilian transport aircraft worldwide, is this: pilot judgment based on real-time situational awareness ultimately supersedes published procedures when circumstances unequivocally demand it. Even the iconic Space Shuttle program faced an eerily similar challenge during its development. Standard landing procedures for powered aircraft called for a long, shallow, gliding approach. However, the shuttle was essentially a massive glider with zero engine power. It had only one chance, one shot to land successfully. Test pilots, recognizing the paradox, developed a drastically steep, high-speed approach that looked inherently dangerous but provided the pilots with maximum necessary control authority until the very last possible moment. The parallel, the essential philosophical link, to Buie's power-off stall technique was both explicit and acknowledged in the flight manuals. RAF Woodbridge officially closed its doors as a military installation in 1993. The enormous runway still remains today, now primarily utilized for light civilian aviation traffic. A small, unassuming plaque positioned near the site of the old control tower quietly commemorates the 4,200 emergency landings successfully conducted there during the dark years of World War II. It does not mention Buie by name. It does not specifically detail the power-off stall technique. But veteran B-17 pilots who occasionally visit the silent site remember vividly. Innovation begins where rules stop working. They remember bringing their crippled bombers in fast and frighteningly hot. They remember intentionally, deliberately stalling that heavy aircraft 20 feet above the unyielding runway. They remember the violent, hard impact and the immediate, overwhelming rush of relief, the knowledge that they had survived against all odds. And they remember, always, that a young 26-year-old captain with no specialized credentials whatsoever broke every single rule in the book to save their lives. Innovation, especially in the brutal theater of warfare, rarely originates in pristine laboratories or meticulously planned strategic sessions. It emerges from operators positioned at the absolute sharp edge of survival, individuals who recognize with painful clarity that the current accepted methods are actively killing them, and who possess the raw courage, discipline, and conviction to try something radically different. Captain Howard Buie possessed no advanced degrees, no access to sophisticated wind tunnels, and no committee approvals. He possessed three crucial things: sharp observation, impeccable logical reasoning, and a profound, fundamental willingness to risk his own life testing a terrifying, untested theory. The power-off stall landing technique succeeded, not because it was elegant or mechanically sophisticated or endorsed by committees. It succeeded because Captain Buie fully understood the actual underlying problem. The true problem was not how to land a B-17 smoothly and beautifully. The actual deadly problem was how to get a dying, barely controllable aircraft firmly onto the ground before it ceased being an aircraft entirely. Conventional procedures were tragically optimized for the wrong scenario. They made three fatal assumptions: sustained control authority, functional, reliable systems, and time to execute the sequence. Damaged bombers returning from combat offered none of these critical elements. Therefore, Buie built a procedure centered on what damaged bombers could still reliably do. They could fly fast, they could fly straight for brief periods, and critically, they could be commanded to fall in a controlled, predictable manner. There is a broader, universal lesson embedded within this historical account concerning institutional knowledge and the vital importance of innovation. Every organization, whether military or corporate, develops its procedures based on accumulated experience and perceived best practices. These procedures often function beautifully under the precise conditions they were initially designed to handle. But when those conditions shift dramatically, when the environment becomes significantly more hostile, when equipment fails in novel and unexpected ways, when the stakes are escalated to life or death, those cherished old procedures can instantly become lethal mandates. The true heroes are the individuals who recognize this critical shift, who grasp the terrifying truth that the most dangerous action in a severe crisis is not breaking the rules. It is following the rules that no longer apply to the current reality. Sometimes survival demands doing the one thing you were explicitly trained never to do. And sometimes that is not reckless abandon or technical ignorance. Sometimes it is simply the only rational choice left available to guarantee life.